The morning of 15th August, 1940, dawned bright and clear over the English Channel. Obergefreiter Franz Bergmann settled into the cramped dorsal gun position of his Heinkel He 111, squinting against the rising sun as his bomber joined the formation assembling over northern France. Around him, 60 aircraft from Kampfgeschwader 26 manoeuvred into their attack boxes, wings glinting like mirrors in the early light. Franz had been briefed on England's defences. The intelligence officers had been dismissive, almost contemptuous. The British were flying outdated fighters, armed with rifle-caliber machine guns. .303 caliber, the same ammunition British infantry carried. Meanwhile, German fighters mounted proper weapons, 20mm cannon that fired explosive shells. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 carried 2 of them, plus machine guns. A single cannon shell could blow apart a wing spar or detonate a fuel tank. The British? They were, throwing pebbles. Franz's Heinkel had been designed to withstand such attacks. Self-sealing fuel tanks that swelled shut when punctured, armour plate protecting the crew stations, a glazed nose that gave excellent visibility for bombing, but was reinforced where it mattered. The bomber could absorb punishment. Their intelligence reports confirmed it. Multiple Heinkels had returned from raids over France, riddled with dozens of hits from British fighters, yet they'd flown home. The pilots always told the same story. The British attacked, their guns made a lot of noise, bullets pinged off the fuselage, and then the Spitfire or Hurricane broke away. The Luftwaffe was losing bombers, certainly, but not at rates that concerned high command. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Franz didn't know, what no German aircrew operating over the Channel that August morning knew, was that the intelligence assessments were catastrophically outdated. The British hadn't simply accepted their supposed disadvantage in firepower. They'd done something far more dangerous. They'd transformed their weakness into devastating strength through a principle so simple it seemed obvious in retrospect, yet so revolutionary it would fundamentally alter aerial combat. They'd learned to make their 8 weak guns fire as one. To understand how the Germans got it so wrong, you have to grasp what they were seeing, or more accurately, what they thought they were seeing. German technical intelligence had thoroughly analysed captured British fighters early in 1940. The Spitfire and Hurricane both mounted 8 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. The Browning was reliable, had an excellent rate of fire, but fired a bullet weighing just 11 grams. The German 7.92mm machine gun fired an almost identical round. Everyone in the Luftwaffe understood rifle-caliber bullets. They'd faced them throughout the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns in Poland and France. They knew exactly what such bullets could and couldn't do. Against unarmoured aircraft, they were lethal. Against modern bombers with self-sealing tanks and armour protection, they were a nuisance. You could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying. The mathematics seemed straightforward. The Luftwaffe's own tests showed that a 7.92mm armour-piercing bullet could penetrate 12mm of armour plate when fired directly at it from close range. But bomber crews weren't standing still. The bullets first had to punch through aluminum skin, pass through internal structure, and only then strike armour. By that point, most bullets had tumbled or deflected. Only a quarter to a third reached the armour with enough energy to matter, and even fewer penetrated. The British were using the same caliber ammunition. Therefore, German intelligence concluded British fighters posed a manageable threat. Bombers would take damage, certainly. Some would be lost, but the formations would get through, deliver their bombs, and return home. The strategy was sound. What the intelligence officers missed, what seemed impossible to miss, but somehow everyone did, was the one detail that rendered all their calculations meaningless. The British weren't relying on individual bullets to cause damage anymore. They were concentrating all 8 guns into a single killing zone in space. The concept was called harmonization, though German crews would come to know it by far more visceral terms. The death zone, the bullet storm, the place where Heinkels died. Each of the 8 Browning machine guns was mounted on adjustable brackets in the fighter's wings. Ground crews could alter the angle of each gun, tilting it slightly inward rather than parallel to the aircraft's centerline. When properly adjusted, all 8 streams of fire converged at a specific distance ahead of the fighter. At that convergence point, typically 250 yards, the 8 separate bullet trajectories merged into an overlapping pattern roughly 4 feet in diameter. Into that small circle of sky, 160 bullets arrived every second. Franz Bergmann knew none of this as his Heinkel crossed the English coast near Portland that 15th of August morning. He scanned the sky through his gun sight, watching for the British fighters he'd been told to expect. They came from above and ahead, diving from the sun just as the training manuals said they would. Spitfires, 6 of them. Franz swung his MG-15 to bear and squeezed the trigger. The gun vibrated against his shoulder, spitting out rounds from its 75-round drum magazine. The Spitfires kept coming. They always did. You fired, they fired back, everyone missed mostly, and then they broke away to set up another attack. Except these didn't break away. The lead Spitfire steadied at what Franz estimated was maybe 250 yards, impossibly close for a fighter to hold its attack. Then it opened fire. What happened next would be seared into Franz's memory for the rest of his life. The Heinkel's port engine simply exploded. Not smoking, not trailing fire exploded. Metal fragments erupted from the cowling in a spray of destruction. Simultaneously, the left wing shuddered as if struck by an invisible fist. Through the glass nose, Franz could see the pilot, Hauptmann Weber, jerk backward in his seat as the windscreen in front of him disintegrated into a spider web of cracks. The co-pilot screamed something Franz couldn't hear over the roar of the dying engine and the whistle of wind through new holes in the fuselage. The attack lasted perhaps 1 second, 1 single second of firing. Then the Spitfire was past, rolling away, and another was lining up for its run. The second Spitfire's burst struck further aft. Franz felt the bomber shudder as dozens of impacts stitched across the fuselage behind him. The radio operator's position went silent. No more chatter over the intercom. The third Spitfire concentrated its fire on the starboard engine. More impacts, more explosions of metal. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, and the propeller began windmilling uselessly. 20 seconds. 3 British fighters had reduced a modern bomber, designed to withstand combat damage, into a burning wreck barely under control. Hauptmann Weber fought the controls, trying to keep the Heinkel level, but with one engine gone and the other damaged, the bomber was falling out of formation. Around them, other Heinkels were suffering similar devastation. Franz watched a Duranier 17 from another Kampfgeschwader take a burst that seemed to cut it in half. The fuselage broke apart just behind the wings, the tail section tumbling away while the forward section pitched into a vertical dive. Another Heinkel nearby was trailing fire from both engines, crew members bailing out, parachutes blossoming against the blue summer sky. This wasn't harassment. This wasn't the ineffective pecking attacks they'd been briefed to expect. This was systematic destruction. The Spitfires weren't spraying bullets in the general direction of their targets. They were placing concentrated bursts into specific points on each bomber. Engine cowlings, wing roots, cockpits, fuel tanks, every place that mattered. And they were doing it with a precision that seemed impossible from such small-caliber weapons. Weber managed to turn the Heinkel back toward France, descending rapidly, the single running engine screaming at full power. They'd never make it home. Franz knew that. Everyone aboard knew that. The question was whether they'd make it to the Channel, where they might ditch and be picked up, or whether they'd auger into English soil. Behind them, the formation they'd been part of was disintegrating under the hammer blows of more British fighters. The Germans had expected opposition. They'd planned for losses. What they hadn't planned for, what no amount of intelligence briefings had prepared them for, was the sheer violence of the British 8-gun armament when used correctly. Bergmann's Heinkel hit the water 3 miles off the French coast. He and 2 other crew members survived. Hauptmann Weber and the radio operator didn't. Of the 60 bombers that had crossed the Channel that morning, only 51 returned to base. 9 were lost. Another 15 landed so heavily damaged they wouldn't fly again for weeks. And this was just one raid on one day. The pattern was repeating across every bomber formation the Luftwaffe sent against Britain. Something fundamental had changed in the air war. The Germans didn't yet understand what. They simply knew that their bombers were dying at rates that made the campaign unsustainable. The British had found a way to make their weak guns strong, to transform volume of fire into TOPA, concentrated lethality. And they'd done it through innovation so elegant it bordered on the obvious once you understood it. All 8 guns, properly angled, converging at the exact moment they needed to destroy you. The secret lay not in the weapons themselves, but in where those weapons pointed. Throughout late 1938 and early 1939, while German planners were finalizing their bomber offensive doctrine, British armament specialists at the Armament Experimental Station at Orfordness on the Suffolk coast were solving a problem that had plagued fighter pilots since guns moved into aircraft wings. Harmonization wasn't a new concept. The term simply meant adjusting where your guns pointed. Every multi-gun fighter needed some form of harmonization. The question was where to set that convergence point, and whether to set one at all. Early British doctrine, established in the mid-1930s, used what was called the Dowding spread. Each gun was harmonized to a different point spread across a wide area 400 yards ahead of the fighter. The theory was straightforward. Fighter pilots were terrible shots. Studies showed hit rates under 2%, even under ideal conditions. If you spread your fire across a large volume of sky, you'd increase your chances of hitting something even with poor aim. It was the shotgun approach to aerial gunnery, spray and pray. By early 1940, combat results from France proved the Dowding spread was a disaster. Pilots were emptying their entire ammunition load without achieving kills. The bullets were too dispersed. Even when strikes were observed, they lacked the concentration to cause serious damage. German bombers with self-sealing tanks and armor were flying home with dozens of holes punched through non-critical areas. Squadron leader Ralph Sawley of Fighter Command's Operational Requirements Branch had seen this problem coming years earlier. In 1934, he'd done something radical for an RAF officer. He'd actually calculated how much damage was needed to destroy a modern bomber. His findings contradicted everything the Air Ministry believed about fighter armament. You needed to land approximately 250 hits on a bomber's vital areas to guarantee a kill. Not 250 bullets fired, 250 bullets that actually struck critical components. With pilots achieving hit rates around 2%, that meant you needed to fire an enormous number of rounds in a very short engagement window. The 8-gun installation on the Spitfire and Hurricane was Sawley's answer to that mathematical reality. 8 guns firing at roughly 1,050 rounds per minute each meant 9,200 rounds per minute combined, 160 bullets every single second. Even with abysmal accuracy, you'd still land enough hits if you got close enough and fired long enough. But there was a better way. The breakthrough came from armament, specialists who actually had to make the guns work in combat. Officers like Squadron Leader F.W. Hill and the technical staff at Orfordness realized that spreading fire across a wide area was solving the wrong problem. The real challenge wasn't increasing the probability of hitting somewhere on the target. It was increasing the damage when you did hit. If you could concentrate all 8 streams of fire into a single point, you'd transform the weapon system entirely. Instead of hoping for scattered hits, you'd guarantee clustered hits. Instead of individual bullets causing incremental damage, you'd have dozens of bullets striking simultaneously, overwhelming whatever protection the target had. The mathematics were compelling. At 400 yards with the Dowding spread, the bullet pattern from 8 guns covered an area roughly 30 feet across. A Heinkel He 111 had a wingspan of 74 feet and a fuselage width of about 7 feet. Your bullets were scattered across, the target with large gaps between hits. But if you harmonized all 8 guns to converge at 250 yards, the pattern shrank to a circle roughly 4 feet in diameter. Now those same bullets were concentrated into an area smaller than the bomber's fuselage width. The density of fire increased by a factor of approximately 50. The trials at Orfordness throughout late 1938 proved the concept. Test pilots flew Spitfires and Hurricanes against towed fabric drogues, firing at different convergence settings and measuring the results. The difference was immediate and undeniable. Unharmonized patterns showed bullet strikes scattered across the entire drogue, with large gaps between hits. Harmonized patterns at 250 yards showed clusters of strikes so concentrated they tore ragged holes through the fabric, with multiple bullets passing through areas barely inches apart. When the target analysis teams examined actual bomber components subjected to harmonized fire, the destruction was remarkable. Wing spars didn't just get punctured, they fragmented. Fuel tanks didn't leak, they ruptured. Engine blocks didn't tolerate a few holes, they cracked. The cumulative effect of dozens of bullets arriving simultaneously in the same location was qualitatively different from scattered hits. It was the difference between a handful of pebbles and a sledgehammer. The decision to standardize on 250 yards convergence was made by Fighter Command in early 1940. The distance represented a calculated trade-off between multiple competing factors. Too close, say 200 yards, and the killing zone was devastatingly effective, but pilots had to press into point-blank range, flying directly into defensive fire. Too far, and bullet drop plus natural dispersion ruined the concentration. At 400 yards, a 1-degree error in aim meant missing by 7 yards. At 250 yards, pilots could open fire from a reasonable combat distance. The bullet drop was manageable, roughly 6 feet at that range, and the concentration remained lethal. Most importantly, the convergence wasn't a single mathematical point, but rather a zone. The 8 bullet streams created an overlap region roughly 50 yards deep, from about 225 to 275 yards, where the concentration stayed deadly. This gave pilots a margin of error. You didn't need to fire at exactly 250 yards. Anywhere within that band, your guns retained their concentrated punch. By April 1940, every Spitfire and Hurricane leaving British factories was harmonized to 250 yards as standard. Individual squadron commanders could authorize different settings for pilots with specific tactical preferences, but the default became doctrine. Ground crews performed the harmonization using a precise procedure. The aircraft was positioned with its tail supported to keep it level. Armourers set up white panels at the desired convergence distance, often marked out across the airfield. Each gun was then individually sighted and adjusted until it pointed at the designated spot. When all 8 were aligned, ink stamps in the aircraft's Form 700 recorded the convergence distance. The technical documentation was meticulous because the RAF understood they were standardizing something unprecedented. Never before had a fighter carried 8 machine guns. Never before had those guns been harmonized to concentrate fire with such precision. The question wasn't whether it would work in theory. The Orfordness trials had proven that. The question was whether it would work in the chaos of actual combat against an enemy who dominated every battlefield they'd fought on. The answer came during the first weeks of the Battle of Britain, and it came as a shock to everyone wearing Luftwaffe grey. On 10th of July, 1940, the date historians mark as the battle's opening day, Luftwaffe formations crossed the Channel, expecting the same opposition they'd crushed over France. Obsolete tactics, poor coordination, demoralized pilots. Instead, they met Spitfires and Hurricanes, whose pilots had spent weeks drilling their deflection shooting at the new convergence range. Flight Lieutenant Al Deer of 54 Squadron engaged a Messerschmitt Bf 109E over Dover that afternoon. His combat report filed that evening noted he'd opened fire at approximately 250 yards during a diving attack. 2-second burst. The Messerschmitt's cockpit canopy exploded, the engine cowling disintegrated, and the aircraft rolled inverted trailing smoke before the pilot bailed out. Gun camera footage showed something the intelligence analysts found remarkable. The strikes weren't scattered across the fuselage. They were concentrated in a cluster around the engine and cockpit area. Every single bullet that hit was landing within a 3-foot radius. That kind of precision wasn't luck, it was geometry. By August, the pattern was undeniable. RAF intelligence compiled loss-to-kill ratios that stunned even optimistic assessments. Luftwaffe bomber formations were suffering catastrophic casualties. On 15th of August, the day Franz Bergmann nearly died over the Channel, the Luftwaffe flew 1,786 sorties and lost 75 aircraft. RAF Fighter Command lost 34 fighters, but 27 of the pilots survived. The Germans weren't just losing aircraft, they were losing experienced crews who couldn't be easily replaced, and they were losing them to what their own technical officers had dismissed as inadequate armament. The Dornier Do-17 proved particularly vulnerable. Intelligence reports had insisted its armour and self-sealing tanks made it resilient. Those reports were based on combat over France, against scattered, uncoordinated attacks, when Spitfires attacked from astern at 250 yards with harmonised guns. The results were different. On 18th of August, Sergeant Eric Ban of 238 Squadron caught a Dornier over Canterbury. 1 3-second burst from dead astern at 250 yards. The Dornier's starboard engine exploded. The wing root failed. The aircraft tumbled into a field near Chatham. All 4 crew killed. Wreckage examination showed 47 bullet strikes within a 3-foot radius around the engine. Textbook harmonization effect. Dozens of bullets arriving in the same heartbeat, in the same location, overwhelming every defense the bomber possessed. The Heinkel He 111 suffered similarly. These were substantial aircraft with armoured crew positions and defensive guns covering multiple angles. Throughout August and September, they fell in shocking numbers. Squadron leader Peter Townsend of 85 Squadron described attacking a Heinkel on 30th of August, close to 200 yards, dead astern. 5-second burst, saw strikes concentrated on fuselage and both engines. Port engine caught fire immediately. Starboard engine smoking badly. Aircraft descended in controlled glide, crashed near Tunbridge Wells. Post-combat examination of that wreckage counted 63 bullet holes in the port engine alone, with another 40 in the starboard engine and fuselage. The concentration had destroyed both power plants simultaneously. What the Germans were experiencing, though they didn't yet have the vocabulary to describe it, was the difference between distributed damage and concentrated destruction. A bomber could absorb scattered hits across its airframe. Self-sealing tanks would seal. Redundant control systems would take over. The crew could patch holes and nurse damaged aircraft home, but when dozens of bullets arrived in the same instant in the same square foot of airframe, there was no absorbing that. Aluminum structure didn't flex under such concentrated kinetic energy. It failed, catastrophically. Fuel tanks didn't gradually leak. They ruptured. Engine blocks didn't tolerate damage. They seized or exploded. Even the Bf 109, Germany's premier fighter, proved vulnerable when caught by harmonized fire at convergence range. These aircraft were small, agile, difficult targets, but when Spitfire pilots achieved firing solutions at 250 yards, the results were decisive. Pilot Officer Bob Doe of 234 Squadron shot down 4 Bf 109s between 8th and 18th of August. His tactic was consistent. Close to 250 yards or less. Short bursts. Aim for wing routes where fuel and ammunition were located. The 8-gun battery was devastating at that range. He later recalled, "If you hit them properly, bits came off." The statistics supported the anecdotal evidence. By the end of September, Fighter Command had destroyed approximately 1,700 German aircraft against losses of 1,000 fighters. The exchange rate favoured the defenders, and the harmonised guns were central to that success. German bomber crews were sending reports back to intelligence that contradicted everything Luftwaffe High Command believed about British capabilities. The rifle-caliber machine guns they'd been told were ineffective were tearing aircraft apart. The attacks they'd expected to be harassment were proving lethal. Something had changed fundamentally in how the British were employing their fighters. What exactly that something was remained unclear. German intelligence knew British fighters carried 8 guns. They'd known that since 1938. What they didn't understand was that those 8 guns were no longer firing as individuals. They were firing as a single weapon system with 8 barrels, all aimed at precisely the same point in space. The concept seemed obvious once explained. Of course, you'd want your guns to converge. Why wouldn't you? But doctrine is often path-dependent. The Germans had developed their fighter armament philosophy around nose-mounted cannon and machine guns firing through the propeller arc. Those weapons were naturally harmonized because they were positioned close to the aircraft's center line. Wing-mounted weapons were an afterthought. The British had gone the opposite direction, embracing wing-mounted guns and developing the supporting doctrine to make them work. The harmonization principle that emerged from awkwardness wasn't just about angling guns. It was about fundamentally rethinking what concentrated fire meant in 3-dimensional aerial combat. And by the time German intelligence fully grasped what the British had done, the Battle of Britain was already decided. The psychological impact on German bomber crews was immediate and profound. Men who'd flown over Poland, Norway, and France with confidence now approached missions over Britain with dread. The mathematics of survival had shifted in ways that violated everything they had been trained to expect. Obergefreiter Hans Müller of Kampfgeschwader 55 wrote in his diary after a raid on 16th of August, "We are told the British fighters are poorly armed. We are told their 8 machine guns lack stopping power. Someone should tell that to Lieutenant Krebs, whose Heinkel exploded over Portsmouth yesterday, or to Hauptmann Dietrich, whose crew burned to death because a 2-second burst from a hurricane set both engines aflame simultaneously." The intelligence officers sit in France and tell us these things. We fly over England and learn otherwise. The Luftwaffe's initial response was denial. Intelligence reports insisted the losses were acceptable, that British fighter command was being ground down, that just a few more days of pressure would break them. But the bomber crews knew differently. They were watching friends die at rates that made formation, flying, and exercise in witnessing systematic slaughter. The problem wasn't just that aircraft were being shot down. That happened in every air campaign. The problem was the speed and violence with which British fighters were destroying bombers. A Heinkel that took hits over France might trail smoke, lose an engine, struggle home. A Heinkel that took a proper burst from a harmonized 8-gun fighter over Britain simply died. Engines exploded, wings folded, fuselages broke apart. There was no time to fight back, no time to bail out. Just sudden catastrophic failure followed by the long fall into English fields or the cold Channel waters. By late August, Luftwaffe High Command was forced to acknowledge reality. Something about British fighter tactics had changed. On 19th of August, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring summoned his unit commanders to Karinhall, his estate outside Berlin, for an emergency conference. The agenda was simple: explain the unacceptable bomber losses and fix them. The meeting revealed how little German intelligence actually understood about what was killing their aircraft. Squadron commanders reported that British fighters were pressing attacks to suicidally close range before opening fire. This was partially true. The 250-yard convergence range was indeed closer than the 400-yard Dowding spread had been, but suicidally close suggested desperation, when in fact it represented cold tactical calculation. The British had determined that 250 yards was where their weapon system achieved maximum lethality, and they'd trained their pilots to fight at that range. Other commanders insisted British fighters must be carrying heavier weapons than intelligence suggested. How else could 8 rifle-caliber guns cause such destruction? Some speculated the British had secretly upgraded to larger caliber machine guns or light cannon. These theories persisted despite gun camera footage and wreckage analysis clearly showing standard .303 caliber bullet holes. The human mind struggles to accept that something dismissed as weak can prove devastatingly effective. It's more comfortable to believe the enemy is cheating than to admit your own assessment was wrong. Göring's solution was characteristically blunt and characteristically inadequate. He ordered a massive increase in fighter escorts for bomber formations. Henceforth, Bomber raids would proceed with fighter-to-bomber ratios of 2-to-1 or higher. If the British were pressing close-range attacks, German fighters would have more opportunities to intercept them before they reached the bombers. The order addressed a symptom while missing the disease. More escort fighters meant fewer fighters free to engage in offensive sweeps. It meant German fighters had to stay close to slow-moving bomber formations rather than leveraging their superior speed and altitude performance. Most critically, it meant accepting that German bombers couldn't survive over Britain without massive protection. This was a strategic admission of failure, though. Nobody at Karin Hall cared to frame it that way. What Göring's conference didn't discuss, because nobody present understood it, was the specific technical innovation making British attacks so lethal. Harmonisation remained invisible to German intelligence throughout the entire Battle of Britain. They knew British fighters had 8 guns. They knew those guns were wing-mounted. They observed that attacks at close range proved devastating, but they never connected these facts into the realization that the 8 guns were being made to fire as one. Part of this blindness was technological. German fighters predominantly used nose-mounted weapons firing through the propeller arc or engine. These weapons were naturally aligned with the aircraft's centerline. There was no need to harmonize them because they were already pointing forward along the same axis. Wing-mounted guns were supplementary weapons on German fighters, not the primary armament. The concept of extensively harmonizing multiple wing guns to a precise convergence point simply wasn't part of Luftwaffe doctrine. Part of the blindness was psychological. When your own experts declare something inadequate, it requires significant mental adjustment to accept that the supposedly inadequate thing is killing you efficiently. It's cognitively easier to assume you're missing some piece of information than to admit your entire analytical framework was wrong. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The British, for their part, had no interest in explaining their success. Harmonization was treated as sensitive tactical information. Pilots were briefed on convergence settings, but not encouraged to discuss the principle behind them. Ground crews who performed the actual gun alignment worked from technical manuals that explained the procedure without elaborating on the tactical implications. German intelligence might eventually figure it out from captured aircraft, but the RAF saw no reason to help them along. By September 1940, the harmonization principle was proving itself under the worst possible conditions. The Battle of Britain had become a brutal attritional struggle. Both sides were exhausted. British pilots were flying multiple sorties per day with minimal rest. German bomber crews were being asked to fly into skies where their survival depended on factors often beyond their control. Yet the fundamental mathematics of the battle favoured the defenders, and harmonised guns were a key factor in that arithmetic. The evolution of harmonisation doctrine continued even as the battle raged. Pilots began requesting personalised convergence settings matched to their individual fighting styles. Squadron leader Douglas Bader was the most vocal advocate for close-range harmonisation. Bader, commanding 242 Squadron from Coltishall, insisted his aircraft be harmonised at 200 yards, 50 yards closer than standard. His reasoning was characteristically blunt. If you can't get close enough to see the rivets, you're wasting ammunition. Bader's aggressive tactics involved closing to point-blank range before firing. At that distance, even with 200-yard convergence, the pattern was tight enough to saw aircraft in half. His combat record supported the approach. 23 confirmed kills by war's end. But Bader's method required exceptional nerve. You had to hold your fire while flying into defensive guns, close to nearly collision distance, then deliver a burst that couldn't miss. Squadron leader Adolf Sailor Malan took the opposite view. Malan, a South African serving with 74 Squadron from Hornchurch, was Fighter Command's leading tactician. He argued for 400-yard harmonisation, insisting that opening fire earlier gave more opportunities to score hits. Malan had developed his 10 rules for air fighting, which emphasised long-range deflection shooting. His logic was sound. At 400 yards, you could engage while still outside effective return fire range, particularly against bombers. You'd get more shooting opportunities during a single pass. The trade-off of reduced bullet concentration didn't bother Milan because his exceptional marksmanship meant he hit targets other pilots would miss. Flight Lieutenant Bob Stanford Tuck of 92 Squadron represented a middle ground, requesting 300-yard convergence. Tuck felt that 250 yards was slightly too close for the tactical situations he typically encountered, while 400 yards sacrificed too much concentration. He particularly liked 300 yards for deflection shooting, attacks from the side or quarter rather than dead astern. At that range, leading a crossing target was more intuitive, and the bullet density remained high enough to cause serious damage. By late August, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding made a pragmatic decision. Squadron commanders could authorize individual harmonization settings if pilots could justify the request with combat results. If a pilot was scoring kills with non-standard convergence, don't interfere. Some squadrons maintained charts showing each pilot's preferred setting, with ground crews marking the aircraft logbooks accordingly. The variations revealed different tactical philosophies. Polish pilots, particularly those in 303 Squadron, generally preferred close harmonization, 200 to 225 yards. They'd learned over Poland and France that aggression worked, that pressing attacks home despite defensive fire was more effective than cautious long-range shooting. RAF pilots from bomber backgrounds often requested longer convergence, 350 to 400 yards, because they were accustomed to calculating lead and drop over distance. Former instructors tended towards standard 250 settings, having taught it and developed muscle memory around it. What Fighter Command discovered was that harmonization wasn't one-size-fits-all. The 250-yard standard worked well for most pilots under most conditions, but exceptional pilots with distinctive styles achieved better results with personalized settings matched to their tactics. The 8-gun installation's flexibility, its ability to be harmonized to different distances without hardware changes, proved as valuable as the convergence principle itself. Meanwhile, German bomber losses continued mounting. September 7th marked a crucial shift in Luftwaffe strategy. Goering, convinced that Fighter Command was nearly broken, ordered the main effort redirected from airfields to London itself. The plan was to force British fighters into a decisive battle of annihilation while crushing civilian morale. The strategic logic was questionable, but for bomber crews, the immediate concern was practical. London meant flying deep into England, maximising exposure to British fighters, and attacking a target that would draw every available Spitfire and Hurricane. The raids on London throughout September became slaughter. Formations of Heinkels, Dorniers, and Junkers crossed the Channel with massive fighter escorts, sometimes 2 or 3 Bf-109s for every bomber. Yet British fighters still broke through. The harmonised 8-gun armament proved lethal even in fleeting firing opportunities. A 2-second burst, engine fire, wing failure, aircraft falling, over and over. By the end of September, Luftwaffe losses had reached unsustainable levels. 1,733 aircraft destroyed, nearly 3,000 crew killed or captured. The exchange rate, which German planning had assumed would favour the attacker, was running approximately 2-to-1 against them. And critically, Germany was losing bombers faster than they could be replaced. British fighter production, despite being targeted repeatedly by Luftwaffe raids, continued exceeding losses. Fighter Command was bloodied but functional. The Luftwaffe was exhausted and breaking. On October 12, 1940, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Without air superiority, a cross-channel assault was suicide. The Battle of Britain was effectively over. German forces would continue bombing Britain through the winter blitz, but the daylight campaign to destroy Fighter Command had failed. Multiple factors contributed to that failure. British radar and control systems, the advantage of fighting over home territory, German strategic confusion. But among those factors, often overlooked in grand strategic analysis, was a tactical innovation that transformed 8 allegedly weak guns into a weapon system capable of devastating effect. The principle of harmonized fire hadn't won the Battle of Britain alone. No single technical factor determines the outcome of major campaigns, but it had been essential. Without harmonization, the 8-gun installation would have remained what German intelligence believed it was: high-volume fire with inadequate concentration, scattered hits that damaged but rarely destroyed. With harmonization, those 8 guns became a precision instrument of destruction. 160 bullets per second, all arriving in a 4-foot circle, all striking simultaneously. The cumulative kinetic energy was staggering. Each .303 bullet carried approximately 2,800 joules of energy at 250 yards. 40 bullets striking simultaneously, a typical result from a quarter-second burst into the convergence zone, delivered 112,000 joules to the target. That's roughly equivalent to being hit by a small car traveling at 30 miles per hour, except the energy was concentrated into an area the size of a tea tray through dozens of individual penetrations. Aircraft structures weren't designed to withstand that. Wing spars were aluminum alloy approximately 1/8 of an inch thick. A single bullet punched through cleanly. 10 bullets hitting within inches of each other didn't just puncture the spar, they fragmented it. Technical reports from the Royal Aircraft Establishment documented exactly what happened when concentrated .303 fire struck aircraft components. Engine blocks cracked when multiple bullets struck cooling fins and cylinder heads simultaneously. Radiators, already vulnerable, became sieves. Self-sealing fuel tanks could handle individual bullet strikes, the rubber lining sealed around the hole. But 10 holes appearing in a cluster overwhelmed the sealing mechanism. Fuel poured out, control cables severed, hydraulic lines ruptured, spraying fluid that often ignited from hot engine components or tracer rounds. The destructive mechanism differed fundamentally from cannon fire. A 20mm cannon shell didn't need multiple hits. One was often enough because the high explosive filler detonated inside the target. But cannon had limitations. The Luftwaffe's MG-FF cannon carried only 60 rounds per gun. A 2-second burst emptied it. The Hispano cannon that would later arm Spitfires held 60 to 120 rounds, depending on variant. The .303 Browning held 300 to 350 rounds per gun, roughly 16 seconds of continuous fire if you were mad enough to hold the trigger down that long. In practice, pilots fired 1 to 2 second bursts. That meant 8 to 16 attacking passes before running dry, versus perhaps 3 or 4 with cannon-armed fighters. The sustainability of the 8-gun battery proved crucial during extended combats. When German formations arrived with heavy escorts, British fighters needed multiple firing opportunities to work through the protection and reach the bombers. Having 16 seconds of ammunition versus 7 seconds of cannon fire meant more chances to score kills. The flexibility to take marginal shots, break away, re-engage, and still have ammunition remaining gave British pilots options their cannon-armed opponents lacked. Of course, the RAF recognised that .303 calibre had limitations. The British had been trying to field 20mm cannon since before the war. The Hispano cannon promised to combine explosive power with reasonable ammunition capacity, but in 1940, the Hispano suffered chronic reliability problems. Guns jammed, feeding mechanisms failed. Installation in the Spitfire's thin wings required extensive redesign. A handful of cannon-armed Spitfires saw service during the Battle of Britain, but most pilots reverted to the 8-gun battery because it worked. The .303 was reliable, proven, and available in quantity. Most importantly, when properly harmonized, it was effective. The debate over machine guns versus cannon would continue throughout the war. Eventually, most air forces transitioned to 20mm or larger cannon as primary armament, but in 1940, when Britain stood alone and invasion loomed, the 8 harmonized .303 Brownings proved exactly what was needed. Adequate individual power, combined through intelligent doctrine into devastating collective effect. The influence of harmonization extended far beyond the Battle of Britain. By late 1940, American observers attached to Fighter Command were sending detailed reports back to Washington. The United States Army Air Corps was developing its own multi-gun fighters. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt would carry 8 50 caliber Brownings. The North American P-51 Mustang initially mounted 4 50 calibers before later variants increased to 6. American engineers studied the RAF's convergence data with intense interest, recognizing that the principle applied regardless of caliber. The heavier 50 caliber round carried more energy, but the ballistic challenge remained identical. Multiple guns needed to concentrate their fire. The Americans adopted harmonization with characteristic thoroughness. USAAF doctrine settled on 300 yards as optimal for the 50 caliber installation, roughly 50 yards farther than RAF practice. The reasoning was ballistic. The heavier 50 caliber bullet retained velocity and energy better over distance than the .303, making longer-range convergence practical. By 1943, every American fighter rolling out of factories had harmonization tables specific to its gun installation, with ground crews trained in adjustment procedures the British had pioneered. The Soviets, receiving Hurricanes and Spitfires through Lend-Lease from 1941 onwards, immediately grasped the significance. Soviet tactical doctrine had traditionally emphasized cannon armament. Their Yak and Lavochkin fighters typically mounted a single 20mm or 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by machine guns. But the concentrated fire principle influenced their thinking about gun placement. Later Soviet fighters like the Yak-3 and La-7 positioned their guns closer together, clustering weapons near the center line to reduce dispersion, rather than spreading them across the wings as earlier designs had done. The Germans learned the painful way. Luftwaffe intelligence initially dismissed British 8-gun installations as inadequate, but combat results forced reassessment. By 1941, captured RAF armament manuals detailing harmonization procedures were being studied at the Luftwaffe's testing facilities. The German response was twofold. First, they increased armor protection on their bombers, particularly around engines and crew positions, attempting to withstand the concentrated fire patterns. Second, they began experimenting with their own convergence settings for the Bf-109's wing-mounted machine guns. German doctrine had traditionally treated the cannon as the primary weapon, with machine guns as secondary, but harmonization demonstrated that properly concentrated machine gun fire could be devastating, even without explosive shells. The principle's influence extended far beyond the Second World War. When jet fighters emerged in the late 1940s and early 1950s, designers immediately incorporated convergence thinking. The North American F-86 Sabre, America's premier Korean War fighter, mounted 6 50 caliber Brownings with convergence settings adjustable between 800 and 1200 feet, far greater distances than propeller-era fighters, reflecting increased combat speeds. The British Hawker Hunter carried 4 30mm Aden cannon clustered tightly in the lower fuselage, minimizing dispersion rather than spreading them across the wings. Soviet MiG-15s positioned their cannon in the nose, again prioritizing concentration over dispersion. Even as missiles began replacing guns as primary fighter armament during the 1960s, the lessons of harmonization remained relevant. Modern fighters retaining guns, like the American F-15 and F-16 with their 20mm Vulcan cannon, or the Russian Su-27 with its 30mm G-31, position these weapons on the centerline firing directly along the aircraft's axis. No harmonization needed when there's only one gun, but the principle of concentrated fire at a specific range still governs how pilots employ them. The idea that emerged from those Suffolk firing ranges in 1938 that angling weapons inward could transform adequate firepower into overwhelming firepower fundamentally altered how nations approached fighter armament. 8 rifle-caliber guns, properly harmonized, proved capable of matching or exceeding the destructive effect of heavier weapons. It wasn't the size of the gun that mattered most. It was where the bullets went and how many arrived simultaneously. That lesson, learned desperately during Britain's darkest hour, became doctrine worldwide. For German bomber crews who survived the Battle of Britain, the memory of those attacks never faded. The sudden violence of British fighter passes, the way aircraft simply exploded under concentrated fire, the impossibility of survival when caught in that convergence zone where 8 guns fired as one. They'd been told British armament was weak. They'd learned otherwise, written in the wreckage of hundreds of bombers scattered across England and the Channel. Obergefreiter Franz Bergmann, pulled from the cold waters off the French coast on that August morning, spent the rest of the war in a British prisoner camp. He survived to return home in 1946. In interviews decades later, he was asked what he remembered most about the Battle of Britain. His answer was immediate: the sound. When a Spitfire opened fire at proper range, you could hear it over everything else, not individual guns. One continuous roar, like cloth tearing, but impossibly loud. That meant all 8 were firing at once. That meant you were in the convergence zone. That meant you were probably about to die. The Germans had called the point 303 weak. They'd dismissed 8 machine guns as inadequate for modern air combat. They'd been wrong, not because the guns themselves were powerful individually, they weren't, but because the British had found a way to make them fire together, to concentrate their volume into precision, to transform quantity into quality, through nothing more complex than geometry and doctrine. 160 rounds per second, 4-foot circle, 250 yards. That was the formula. Simple enough to teach to every pilot, devastating enough to help save Britain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.